Arizona Territory, autumn of 1884. The wind carried whispers through the red dust, whispers that clung to your boots and followed you home. In the town of Perdition Wells, where the sun baked the earth until it cracked like broken promises, there lived a woman who never spoke above a whisper herself. They called her many things. Witch, devil's daughter, the bringer of ruin. But her name was Serafina, and she lived alone in a cabin at the edge of nowhere, where the desert began to swallow the last hopes of civilization. The townspeople crossed themselves when they saw her shadow. Children hid behind their mother's skirts when she walked to the general store, coins clutched tight in her pale fingers, eyes fixed on the ground like she was searching for something she'd lost long ago. The preacher said her very presence was an affront to God. The doctor blamed her for every fever that wouldn't break, every wound that wouldn't heal. The banker whispered that since she'd arrived 3 years ago, nothing had grown right in Perdition Wells. The crops withered, the cattle died, even the rain seemed to avoid their piece of earth. But 30 miles west, where the mesa broke into rolling hills and ancient oak trees cast shadows like cathedral spires, lived a man who'd never heard her name spoken with anything but fear. Samuel Thorne worked a spread of land that his father had carved from wilderness, a place where silence wasn't empty but full of possibility. He was 34, weathered by sun and solitude, with hands that knew how to coax life from stubborn soil, and eyes that held more questions than most men cared to ask. Samuel had lost his wife 4 years past to a fever that no prayer could touch, no medicine could cure. The grief had settled into his bones like winter cold, the kind that never fully leaves. He lived alone now except for his cattle, his horses, and the memories that visited him each evening when the light died behind the mountains. He was a man who understood loss, who knew the weight of being blamed for things beyond your control. His neighbors whispered that he should remarry, that his land needed a woman's touch, that a man wasn't meant to live alone with only ghosts for company. But Samuel had no patience for their matchmaking, no interest in their daughters or widows or visiting cousins from back east. He'd learned to find peace in the rhythm of work, in the honest conversation between man and beast, in the way morning light painted the world new every day. He might have lived out his years in that quiet contentment, might have grown old with only the wind for company, if not for the day he rode into Perdition Wells to buy winter supplies and saw something that stopped his heart cold. She stood outside Garrett's Mercantile, a slip of a woman in a faded blue dress, her dark hair pinned back severe and simple. But it wasn't her appearance that caught his attention. It was the way the crowd moved around her, like water flowing around a stone, careful not to touch, careful not to look directly at her face. It was the way she held herself, straight-backed and proud despite the weight of their judgment, like a flower that bloomed beautiful even in poisoned soil. Samuel watched from his horse as she placed her coins on the counter with steady hands, as she accepted her small bundle of goods without meeting the storekeeper's eyes, as she walked back toward the edge of town with her head high and her steps measured. He watched the children point and whisper. He watched the women clutch their shawls tighter. He watched the men spit in the dust after she passed. And something inside his chest, something that had been cold and still for years, began to stir like embers touched by wind. That evening, as Samuel sat on his porch watching the stars appear one by one in the endless sky, he found himself thinking about the woman in the blue dress, about the way she'd carried herself through a town that clearly despised her, about the loneliness that seemed to radiate from her small frame like heat from a banked fire. He thought about the whispers he'd heard in the store after she left, words like cursed and unnatural and better off dead. He thought about his own loneliness, about the way grief had taught him that sometimes the world blamed you for things that were simply God's will or nature's way, or the cruel randomness of existence. He thought about how easy it was to make someone a scapegoat when you needed somewhere to put your pain. The next morning, Samuel loaded his wagon with supplies. Not the supplies he needed for his ranch, but different things. A bag of flour, some salt pork, fresh apples from his own trees, a bundle of firewood cut and split with care. He told himself he was just being neighborly, that any decent man would check on someone living alone at the edge of civilization. He told himself it had nothing to do with the way her image had lingered in his mind, or the way his chest had tightened when he saw the fear in the children's faces as they looked at her. The ride to the edge of Perdition Wells took him through country he rarely traveled, land that grew more desolate the closer he came to town. The woman's cabin sat on a small rise overlooking a dry creek bed, a modest structure of weathered wood and stone that looked like it was holding its breath, waiting for the wind to finally blow it away. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray line. A small garden struggled behind the house, the plants brown and withered despite what should have been good growing season. Samuel sat in his wagon for a long moment, studying the place. The cabin was neat, well maintained despite its isolation. Firewood was stacked with military precision. A few chickens scratched in a wire pen. Laundry hung on a line, simple garments moving in the breeze like prayers made visible. It looked like the home of someone who worked hard to survive, not the lair of something evil. He climbed down from the wagon and approached the front door, his boots crunching on the dry earth. Before he could knock, the door opened. She stood there in the same blue dress, but up close he could see the delicate bones of her face, the way her dark eyes held depths he couldn't fathom. She looked at him without surprise, as if she'd been expecting him, as if she'd watched him ride up from behind her curtained windows. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the sparse trees with a sound like distant music. "Ma'am," Samuel said finally, touching the brim of his hat. "Mr. Thorne," she said, and her voice was like water over stones, soft but clear. She knew his name, though he'd never introduced himself. In a place like Perdition Wells, everyone knew everyone, especially a man who owned good land and lived alone. "Miss," he replied, then paused. "I'm sorry, I don't know your proper name." "Seraphina," she said. "Seraphina Blackwood. Miss Blackwood." He gestured toward his wagon. "I brought some supplies. Thought you might could use them, living out here on your own." Her eyes moved past him to the wagon, taking in the flour sack, the firewood, the small crate of apples. Something flickered across her face, too quick to read. Suspicion, maybe, or surprise. When was the last time someone had offered her kindness without expecting something in return? "That's very generous," she said carefully, "but I can't pay you for them." "Didn't ask you to?" She studied his face then, really looked at him, as if searching for the trap hidden behind his words. Samuel stood still under her scrutiny, letting her take his measure. He had an honest face, he'd been told. Weathered but kind, eyes that didn't lie. "Why?" she asked finally. It was a fair question. Samuel considered it, rolling his hat between his hands. "My wife died 4 years back," he said. "Fever took her in 3 days. Folks in my valley, they brought food for weeks after. Helped with the burial, sat with me when the nights got too long. Figured I ought to pass that kindness along when I can." Seraphina's expression softened, just a fraction. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you, ma'am." Another silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that held understanding. Two people who knew what it meant to carry grief alone. "The supplies," she said finally. "I'll accept them, but only if you'll let me offer you something in return. Coffee's hot, and I've got biscuits from this morning." Samuel nodded. "That'd be welcome." He unloaded the wagon while she disappeared inside, carrying the flour and salt pork to her door. The firewood he stacked beside her existing pile, noting how low it had gotten. Winter was coming early this year. He could feel it in the way the wind had changed, see it in how the light fell different across the land. When he finished, she was waiting with 2 tin cups and a plate of biscuits that smelled like heaven. They sat on her small porch, the boards creaking slightly under their weight. The coffee was strong and bitter, the way men liked it. The biscuits were light as air. "You make a fine biscuit, Miss Blackwood." "Thank you." She sipped her coffee, eyes distant. "My grandmother's recipe. She taught me to cook when I was small, before—" The sentence hung unfinished in the air. Samuel didn't press. Everyone had befores they didn't care to discuss. "You been in Perdition Wells long?" he asked instead. 3 years. Her voice went flat. 3 years this October. And before that. She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she spoke, her words came slow and careful. "Kansas. I had a husband there. He died in a mining accident, left me with nothing but debts. His brother said I brought bad luck, that the mine collapse was my fault somehow. Other folks started saying the same, blame me for everything that went wrong in town. So I left." Samuel nodded. He'd seen it before, the way grief and fear made people cruel, the way they needed someone to blame when the world turned dark and senseless. "But it followed me here," she continued, staring out at the desert horizon. "The talk, the blame, seems no matter where I go, I'm the reason for every crop that fails, every child that takes sick. They say I'm cursed. Maybe they're right. You believe that?" She looked at him then, really looked, and he saw something break open in her eyes. "Some days I do. When you hear something enough times, it starts to feel true. When every door closes in your face, when children run from your shadow, when grown men cross the street to avoid you." She shook her head. "Maybe there is something wrong with me. Maybe I do bring misfortune." Samuel set down his coffee cup and turned to face her fully. "Miss Blackwood, can I tell you something?" She nodded. "After my Sarah died, I blamed myself for months. Thought if I'd been a better husband, if I'd gotten the doctor sooner, if I'd prayed harder, maybe she'd have lived. Folks told me it wasn't my fault, but I couldn't hear it. Grief makes you deaf to sense sometimes." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But Sarah, she used to say that some people are just lightning rods for other folks' pain. They draw all the hurt and fear and anger because it's easier to blame one person than to accept that sometimes terrible things just happen. Sometimes the crops fail because it doesn't rain. Sometimes children get sick because that's what children do. Sometimes good people die for no reason at all." Seraphina's hands trembled slightly around her cup. "You think that's what I am? A lightning rod?" "I think you're a woman who's had more than her share of sorrow, and I think this town needs someone to blame for their troubles. Doesn't make it true." They sat in silence after that, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals with lazy grace. In the distance, the mountains shimmered like a mirage. "Mr. Thorne," Seraphina said finally, "you should know that being seen with me won't do your reputation any favors. Folks in town, they don't take kindly to anyone who shows me courtesy." Samuel stood, brushing biscuit crumbs from his pants. "Miss Blackwood, I'm 34 years old. I've buried a wife, lost 2 brothers in the war, and watched good men die for bad reasons. If I worried about what folks thought of every kindness I showed, I'd have stopped being human a long time ago." He settled his hat on his head and looked down at her. She seemed so small sitting there, so alone. But there was steel in her spine, strength in the way she held her head high despite everything. "I'll be back," he said, "if that's all right with you." She nodded, just barely. "It's all right with me." Samuel climbed into his wagon and turned the horses toward home. As he rode away, he could feel her watching him go. When he reached the top of the rise, he looked back once. She was still there on the porch, a small figure in blue against the weathered wood of her cabin. That night, as Samuel lay in his empty bed listening to the wind test his shutters, he thought about the way her voice had broken when she talked about being blamed for things beyond her control. He thought about the careful way she'd accepted his kindness, like someone who'd learned not to trust gifts that came too easy. He thought about the loneliness that radiated from her like heat from sun-baked stone. And for the first time in 4 years, Samuel Thorne fell asleep thinking about someone other than his dead wife. The weeks that followed passed like water over stone, slow but persistent, wearing away the sharp edges of suspicion. Samuel kept his word, returning to Seraphina's cabin every few days with supplies, with conversation, with the simple gift of his presence. He never stayed long, never overstepped the careful boundaries she'd drawn around herself, but he came. In a world that had taught her to expect abandonment, he showed up. October painted the desert in shades of amber and rust. The cottonwoods along the dry creek began to shed their leaves, golden coins scattered on the wind. Samuel brought winter provisions, thick wool blankets, lamp oil for the long nights ahead. Seraphina accepted them with quiet gratitude, but she gave back too. Hot meals when he arrived hungry from the trail, mended tears in his shirts with stitches so small they seemed like magic. Stories, carefully chosen, about her life before the blame began to follow her like a shadow. She'd been a teacher once, in a one-room schoolhouse in Kansas. Had loved the way children's faces lit up when they finally understood a difficult lesson. Had dreamed of filling young minds with poetry and arithmetic, of watching them grow into good people who would make the world better. But after the mind collapse, after the whispers started, the school board had let her go. No explanation needed. Everyone knew why. Samuel listened to these fragments of her past like a man starving for sustenance. He told her about his ranch, about the satisfaction of watching cattle grow fat on good grass, about the way sunrise looked different when you had something worth waking up for. He told her about Sarah, about their plans for children who never came, about the house they'd built together with their own hands and their own hopes. Neither spoke of love. Neither dared name the thing growing between them like desert wildflowers after rain, unexpected and precious. But it was there in the way Samuel's eyes lingered on her face when she laughed. There in the way Seraphina's hands trembled when he brushed past her reaching for his coat. There in the silence that settled comfortable between them, the kind of quiet that only came when two souls recognized each other across the vast loneliness of existence. But the town of Perdition Wells was watching. It started with looks, sharp glances when Samuel rode through on his way to or from Seraphina's cabin. Then came the whispers, voices dropping low when he entered the mercantile or the saloon. The preacher made pointed remarks about consorting with evil. The banker mentioned how unfortunate it would be if Samuel's credit became questionable. Doc Morrison shook his head sadly and spoke of good men led astray by feminine wiles. Samuel ignored them all. He'd faced down Apache war parties and survived 4 years of grief. The disapproval of small-minded people didn't concern him. But when Jake Wheeler cornered him outside the saloon one evening in late October, alcohol sharp on his breath and anger sharper in his eyes, Samuel knew the situation had moved beyond whispers. "You're making a mistake, Thorne," Wheeler said, blocking Samuel's path to his horse. 3 other men flanked him, faces hard in the lamplight spilling from the saloon windows. "That woman's poison. She's already started working her evil on you." Samuel kept his voice level, his hands relaxed at his sides. "Step aside, Jake." "Look at you," Wheeler continued, emboldened by his audience. "Used to be a respectable man. Good Christian rancher. Now you're running supplies to that witch like some lovesick fool. She's got her hooks in you deep." "Last warning," Samuel said quietly. Wheeler laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Or what? You'll hex me? Maybe she's taught you some of her dark arts. Maybe that's why your cattle are doing so well when everyone else's are dying off. Makes a man wonder what kind of bargain you struck." The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke. Samuel felt something cold and dangerous unfurl in his chest. "My cattle are healthy because I work hard and treat them right. Same reason my land produces and my water runs clean. Same reason I can look at myself in the mirror every morning." "Can you?" Wheeler stepped closer, whiskey courage making him bold. "Can you really? Or do you see what we all see? A man bewitched. A man who's forgotten his place, forgotten his people, forgotten his God." Samuel's hand moved to his gun, not drawing but letting it rest on the grip. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable. "Jake, you're drunk and you're talking foolish. Go home to your wife." "My wife's dead," Wheeler snarled. "Died of fever 2 weeks ago while you've been playing house with that devil woman. You think that's coincidence? You think your witch doesn't know exactly what she's doing?" The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. Mrs. Wheeler had been a kind woman, gentle and generous. He'd liked her, had always wondered how she'd ended up married to a man like Jake. Her death was a genuine loss, another piece of goodness stolen from a world that had too little to spare. But grief, Samuel knew, could make monsters of good men. And Jake Wheeler had never been particularly good to begin with. "I'm sorry for your loss," Samuel said, and meant it. "Truly, but Serafina had nothing to do with your wife's death. Sometimes people die, Jake. Sometimes the world just breaks your heart for no reason at all." "Don't you speak her name," Wheeler spat. "Don't you dare speak my Mary's name while you're defending that creature. You want to know what I think? I think you're as cursed as she is now. I think whatever evil lives in her has crawled into you too." The other men murmured agreement. Samuel recognized them all. Thompson, who owned the feed store. Martinez, who ran cattle on the spread north of town. Young Billy Garrett, whose father owned the mercantile. Good men, most of them, but frightened men. And frightened men did terrible things when they thought they had righteous cause. "I think," Wheeler continued, his voice rising, "that this town would be better off if both of you just disappeared. Permanently." The threat was clear. Samuel's hand tightened on his gun. "You threatening me, Jake?" "I'm warning you. All of us are warning you. Stay away from her. Send her packing. Make this right before it's too late." "And if I don't?" Wheeler smiled, but it was the kind of smile that belonged on a snake. "Then we'll make it right ourselves." Samuel looked at each man in turn, memorizing faces, cataloging threats. These were his neighbors, men he'd known for years, men he'd helped during hard times, men who'd borrowed tools and horses and never been refused. But fear had poisoned them, turned them into something ugly and dangerous. "Gentlemen," Samuel said finally, tipping his hat, "I'll be sure to pass along your concerns." He mounted his horse and rode away, but he could feel their eyes on his back until he disappeared into the darkness beyond the town limits. The ride home took him past Serafina's cabin. A light glowed warm in her window, and for a moment he considered stopping, considered warning her about the mood in town. But what could he say? That angry men had made angry threats? That grief and superstition had twisted good people into something dangerous? She already knew. Had always known. The fear in her eyes when she looked toward town told him that much. Instead, Samuel rode home to his empty house and spent the night cleaning his weapons, not because he wanted violence, but because sometimes violence came whether you wanted it or not. And if it came for Serafina, it would have to go through him first. The next morning dawned gray and cold, with clouds building on the horizon like an army gathering for battle. Samuel finished his chores early and saddled his horse. He had a decision to make, one that would change everything. He could heed the town's warning, could distance himself from Serafina for both their sakes, could let fear win the way it had won so many times before, or he could ride to her cabin and tell her what was in his heart before it was too late. The choice, when it came down to it, wasn't really a choice at all. Samuel Thorne had spent 4 years learning to live with regret. He wouldn't spend another day regretting the words he'd never said to the woman who'd brought light back into his world. The ride to Serafina's cabin felt longer than usual, each hoofbeat echoing like a countdown. When her small house came into view, Samuel saw her in the garden, pulling the last vegetables before the first frost could claim them. She looked up at his approach, shading her eyes against the weak sun, and something in her expression told him she'd been expecting this moment too. "Mr. Thorne," she called, straightening with a handful of carrots clutched in her dirt-stained fingers. "You're early today." Samuel dismounted slowly, suddenly uncertain how to begin. All the words he'd practiced on the ride seemed inadequate now, too small for the magnitude of what he felt. Serafina waited, patient as always. But he could see the questions in her dark eyes. "Miss Blackwood," he said finally. "Serafina, there's something I need to tell you." She set down the carrots and wiped her hands on her apron, a gesture so simple and domestic it made his chest tight. "What is it?" "Last night, some men from town cornered me. Made it clear they don't approve of my visits here. Made some threats." Her face went pale, but she didn't look surprised. "I see. They want me to stop coming. Want me to convince you to leave Perdition Wells. And will you?" The question came out barely above a whisper. Samuel stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, close enough to smell the scent of sage and soap that always seemed to cling to her skin. "Serafina, I need you to understand something. These past weeks, coming here, talking with you, sharing meals and stories in silence, it's been the first time in 4 years that I've felt alive instead of just breathing." Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak. "When Sarah died, I thought my heart died with her. Thought I'd never feel anything again but empty space and old grief. But you've shown me that a man can love more than once. That maybe the heart doesn't die. Maybe it just goes quiet until the right person comes along to wake it up again." "Samuel," she breathed, and the sound of his name on her lips was like music he'd forgotten how to hear. "I know what this town thinks of you. I know what they'll think of me for saying this, but I don't care about their opinions. I care about you. I care about the way you make coffee strong enough to wake the dead and the way you mend my shirts like they matter. I care about the stories you tell and the way you listen when I talk about things I've never told another living soul." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. And when she didn't, he cupped her face in his work-roughened hands. "They call you cursed, but you're not a curse, Serafina. You're my blessing, the answer to prayers I was too proud to pray." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she didn't step away. "You don't know what you're saying. You don't know what associating with me will cost you. I know exactly what it'll cost, and I know it's worth it. Samuel, I can't. I won't let you ruin your life for me. You have a good name, good land, a place in this community. I won't be the reason you lose all that." "You're not taking anything from me," he said fiercely. "You're giving me everything. A reason to wake up in the morning, someone to share the sunset with, a future that looks like more than just surviving until I die." She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch like a woman starving for kindness. What if they're right? What if I really am cursed? What if loving me brings you nothing but sorrow? Samuel smiled then, the first real smile he'd worn in years. "Serafina Blackwood, loving you is the first thing that's felt right since the day I buried my wife. If that's a curse, then I'll wear it gladly." When she opened her eyes, they were bright with tears and something else. Something that looked like hope. "You really mean it. Every word." "Then God help us both," she whispered, and rose on her toes to kiss him. It was a soft kiss, tentative and sweet, tasting of tears and possibility. When they broke apart, Samuel rested his forehead against hers, breathing in the moment, memorizing it against whatever darkness might come. "What happens now?" Serafina asked. Samuel straightened, his jaw setting with determination. "Now we face whatever comes together, as it should be." But even as he spoke the words, he could see the dust cloud on the horizon, riders approaching fast from the direction of town. The reckoning he'd been dreading was coming, and it was coming now.